The subject matter in this episode may not be suitable for young listeners, so please be advised and use your discretion accordingly. Being a ministry wife is a vocation without a job description. And let's be honest, sometimes it seems like ministry might be easier if we did have one. If you are a ministry wife like me and are looking for hope, perspective, and a little bit of practical advice regarding your role, you're in the right place. Hi, I'm Christine Hoover, author of How to Thrive as a Pastor's Wife. Welcome to the Ministry Wives Podcast, a production of the North American Mission Board. Join me as we hear from women from various ministry contexts, having authentic conversations about our shared joys and challenges, even the ones we're unsure we can talk about out loud. No topic is off limits. My guest today is Andrea Valenti. Andrea and her husband of 16 years are originally from Arizona, but they have most recently been serving in Napa, California. They moved to Napa to revitalize a dying church, and that's what we talk about together today. Andrea shares about the unique work of church revitalization. She also shares about her experience with burnout and what advice she would give pastors' wives listening who are exhausted or experiencing intense trials. Here, friends, is my conversation with Andrea Valenti. Well, hey, Andrea, I'm so excited to welcome you to the Ministry Wives Podcast.
Thank you, Christine. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I've gotten to chat with you just briefly, but I'm excited to get to hear your story today of revitalization and burnout. Those are two topics, actually, that I wanted to talk to someone on this podcast about, and two topics that I know a lot of women who are listening are either doing or have experienced. And so I'm super excited to hear your story today. So let's just start, if you don't mind, by sharing about where you are currently in your ministry context and just maybe the cultural context you're in, but also about your church. We want to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So currently my husband and I are serving in Napa, California, which is a county in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we have been here for about 5 years. We have an 11-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter. I was going to say we came into an established church that had been around for about 40 years.
40 years. How many people were there when you guys got there?
So that was one of the unique things for our revitalization story, was that they had kind of fluctuating between 100 and 115 when we moved here.
Okay, so what we think of Napa as the outsider is probably what the tourist thinks of Napa. But I would love to know your perspective on Napa from someone who's there laboring in the gospel. What's the cultural context you're serving in?
Yeah, certainly part of what brought us out to the Bay Area and to Napa specifically was this is consistently, when Barna does its research, one of the most unchurched and unreached areas in the country. And so when we were thinking about transitioning and feeling that God was calling us to somewhere else, that was certainly something that was on our mind, as we wanted to go somewhere where we were needed and also where our gifts would be most used. Also, one of the things about Napa I think people don't necessarily consider is that Napa is part of the Bay Area, but it is still unique in that it is probably more rural than some of the rest of the Bay Area counties, that there's still a large generational component to it where families have been here for decades. They were here picking prunes and doing all different kinds of agricultural things. And so it feels smaller a lot of times than it actually is, because families have been here for so long and everyone knows each other, went to high school with each other. And so that was part of our transition process, was kind of getting used to a smaller context. Also, because it is unreached and unchurched, it's a really small Christian community, and people are not necessarily going to church along denominational lines, which I think is unique to this context, that people kind of just follow to what church is maybe most popular in that season, but will make huge denominational switches. So, from being SBC to Assemblies of God to anything in between.
Interesting. I'm wondering also if there's a huge gap in socioeconomic groups there, because I would think you'd have a lot of maybe agricultural workers who are actually doing the work of picking the fruit, or maybe you have very wealthy people who are owning those properties? I don't know. That's what I'm imagining. You tell me.
Yeah, certainly there is a divide about whether Napa is catering to visitors or to the families and the people who actually live here. And so there is a little bit of that tension that you feel in terms of properties and housing and kind of some of the things that our church members might face. It is certainly very expensive to live here in a lot of the ways that our church members have gotten around that, and people in the community is kind of generationally you move on to your family's property so that you have multi-generational living in their own homes but within the same property boundary lines because they just can't afford to live here.
Wow.
And in some instances it's still cheaper to live here than in some of those higher tech areas in the Bay. And so we've actually, especially during the pandemic, had a lot of people move out of San Francisco proper and out of the city into Napa because Napa was still cheaper than where they were living before.
Interesting. Wow. Okay. So how did y'all end up there? You're not from Napa originally, right?
No, we are actually from Phoenix, Arizona, and we were serving in an inner city church for 14 years. So that was also a big shift for us to go from being inner city to being somewhere we're much more affluent. And actually less multicultural than where we were serving before because we had a multicultural church in Phoenix. And part of that process is we actually had a Spanglish service, and the pastor who was our worship pastor had come to my husband and said that he felt like he was being called to being a head pastor, and he actually speaks Spanish. And so, whereas my husband does not. And so he was having to have someone translate for him. And so kind of in this process of developing him as a leader, felt like God was prompting him to allow that person to take over so that he could better relate to the community that we were serving in, and felt that God was prompting us. And so, as I mentioned before, when we were considering where God may be calling us to, we definitely wanted to go somewhere where we felt our talents could be most used. And so searching for places that were unreached and didn't have someone serving there yet was on our heart of a place we wanted to be called to.
Did you feel called to revitalization in particular, or church planting, or what did it matter to you?
So we have a heart for revitalization. And actually in thinking about this, I realized that our whole time in ministry, we have actually been as part of some type of revitalization, which you would not necessarily think that right away. It was maybe not as obvious as this current revitalization process has been. But I think that my husband and I both are wired towards seeing a bigger picture and kind of seeing maybe the potential that is available, whether it be specifically in a revitalization or something that's existing now, but being able to dream about what it could be. And so we both really like also things that are vintage. He collects vintage watches. We've had vintage cars throughout the year. And so I think there is something beautiful in seeing something that has existed and being able to hopefully repurpose it and to find new meaning for that.
That's so interesting. I love how you put that, because I do think sometimes when we planted, I remember thinking, what does the Lord have? Why does he have us going to this specific place? It just seemed very out of left field. And once we got there, I realized, it does suit who we are, and the needs here do suit the gifts that we bring. And so that's interesting that you kind of say the same thing. Do you feel like it matches now that you're there and you're in the church and you've been there for a while and you're in Napa? Do you feel like it really does kind of match who you are and what your gifts are?
Yes, I think that certainly, again, in terms of the revitalization and being able to cast vision for this region and specifically for our church and for our city was certainly a good match for our gifting. In my professional life, I also am trained as a crisis mental health social worker. So in addition to my husband's work, I like to kind of triage things and kind of see where we kind of need to allocate resources and what kind of things we need to set up. And so I think that both myself and my husband really enjoy kind of change and fast-paced change. And so this idea of being able to kind of see and help and triage and move forward was really a good fit for us.
Wow. That's really cool. And I hope encouraging to someone listening who are like, do I have gifts that God can use? Yes, you do. And he'll place you where he wants you to be to use those. So I'd love to talk, Andrea, about when you got there. What first of all, how did you know this was a revitalization? I mean, were there the indicators? Was that actually said out loud? Like what was the state of the church whenever y'all came to it?
Yeah, so that was one of the things we were lucky to step into, was that the church that we took over has kind of merged with different churches throughout its 40-year season. And there was a church that had died off and had gifted them a large sum of money. And along with that process, the head pastor who was here was retiring and moving out of state to go and spend more time with his grandchildren. And so they had brought in a consultant who advised them that, despite this influx of money and these other things, is that you are still starting to dwindle in terms of church attendance, and that if you don't make some significant changes, that your church will also die. And so this church consultant was able to give them some feedback of what that looked like as they went to find a new pastor. And that was definitely on the search team's mindset when they were going to do that. And so we were lucky because they had started some of the process of some of that culture war that sometimes can happen in terms of revitalization of, the new worship styles and some of those things, but also they had started making some changes that maybe we had to continue to shepherd them through, but we didn't have necessarily as much input into those changes as they were happening.
Okay, so you mentioned a few obstacles there that you're facing as you come in, decisions that were made prior to you, kind of a decline in numbers, maybe a feeling of momentum dropping. Are there other obstacles that you faced? And then I'd love to know the opposite of that. What excited you about those things? Because to me, that's a little daunting.
Yeah, so specifically, again, for this context, they had voted on a name change. And even though it was voted on, there was still a large group of people who were unhappy about that change. Because again, generationally, they had family members who had been attending it under this other name. They had different people who had created the signs, for example, out front. And then along with that, they had started remodeling the building. So they had taken some of the funds that they had received from the other church closing and had started the remodelization process. And we're actually almost finished by the time we got there. And so I think that we would have made some different choices, especially coming from inner city ministry and thinking about how we could best use those dollars, for example.
Yeah.
Kind of just helping them through that process.
Yeah. So what excited you about that, Andrea?
Yeah. I think the idea of what could be. And we definitely also, I'm so grateful. And I think for anybody who's considering revitalization or church planting or any of those kind of big transitions, is that my husband and I were very united in our calling to come here. And we knew very specifically that God had called us not only to change, but to come here, which had never previously been on our radar. We served at our last church for 14 years. We loved it. It was healthy. It was growing. And we had no plans on leaving. And it was actually, we had an elder-based church, and we had different elders who were preaching through Acts along with my husband. And I remember for me specifically, one of our elders was preaching, and I don't remember the specific passage in Acts, but it was just that Paul went was the thought. And with that, this idea that if Paul hadn't left all these churches that he loved, then the gospel would have spread. And so that definitely got us through some tougher times. There was other personal transitions that happened along with us moving. I had been working full time at a very intense job and went literally from working 55 hours a week to now I'm a stay-at-home mom of a under 2-year-old and moving away from family. And so if we didn't know so specifically that God had called us to do this and called us specifically to this region, then it would have been a lot more challenging.
Yeah. Well, you speak for a lot of women out there who are doing this kind of work. They are specifically with their husbands called to replant or revitalize a church. And I don't know what that's like. And so I would love for you to speak for those women and just help us to understand what are the unique challenges that you see, because you've done different types of ministry before. What do you think are the unique challenges that women in your spot are facing?
Yeah, I think certainly something that came to mind for us was that there are always going to be skeletons in the closet. No
Oh,
matter how much they have prepped you ahead of time, there's always going to be something that you're going to find out that you weren't aware of ahead of time. And some of those are larger things and some of them are smaller things. I think also I was not aware of how much shepherding was going to be required in this process. In terms of, we had a lot larger remnant than a lot of people get, but there's certainly usually still some type of remnant. And so there's people who've experienced a lot of church hurt, who have a lot of traditions, and some of them are very valuable and meaningful, and some of them need to change. And so I think that there always needs to be kind of a gauge of how slow you need to go. And a lot of times a lot slower than you would even expect as you're trying to help people navigate those changes that some of them, as like we experienced, they were on board for in theory, but when it came time to actually enforce some of those or the practicality of living those out, we're just still not ready. And there was some hurt from that. And then I think we were lucky, but I'm a part of a lot of different church planter and pastor wives social media pages, and I've seen a lot of where the pastor has retired or they moved and the pastor has stayed. And I think that that is something that is really challenging in existing churches and revitalizations, is if any of the pastors and the leadership stay and kind of navigating who is the authority still, and then a lot of the comparison. So for a lot of our wives experiencing comparison to the former pastor's wife who sometimes is still in the church. And so that can be a tricky thing to navigate, and also then inheriting sometimes staff. And so determining how do you manage that. Unfortunately for the staff that we inherited, which was not a ton, but they had been told by the previous pastor that they were probably all going to be fired. And so that was really hard for my husband to navigate in the beginning of, okay, reassuring people like, I'm not here to have you all lose your jobs, and, trying to just even hear feedback and figure out where to go from there.
Wow. I'd love to talk some, since you have this mental health expertise and you're also talking about church hurt, that you're coming into a situation where people have been hurt or they've been through conflict. There are a lot of women, whether they're revitalized, whether they're replanting or just any sort of church environment, they're dealing with that. So what have you learned? What would you tell us of how to approach that kind of situation when we're brand new and there's some hurt and conflict that's happened?
I think it definitely depends on the situation and where the source of that is. There is certainly going to be a need for some validation and to hear people and meet them where they're at. So you need to actually be able to listen and to see, because a lot of times the things that people may be complaining about is not necessarily the thing they're upset about. And so for us, for example, particularly in the beginning, because most of the people at the church were elderly, and if someone passed away or there was some kind of issue that came up around health, I think that we would sometimes have other people who would get frustrated because they were concerned about how they would be treated in those moments if it was them. And so I think seeing where the hurt comes from and trying to not take it personally, which is always it is really a challenging thing. I appreciate that there's thankfully a lot of articles about criticism and being able to navigate that. Sometimes there is some truth in criticism and sometimes they're not, but really having to take what you can and move forward from those.
How long did you say y'all have been there now?
5 years.
5 years. Now, you've said to me before that you've experienced some burnout in ministry. Has that happened in Napa, or was that prior to the move? Or both?
So, I would say both, actually. And it's funny because to be honest with you, as I was looking at the questions and preparing for this, initially I had thought more from like a mental health standpoint, right? Of course, I can talk about burnout. I can talk about what it's like to be in a helping profession. And I saw the questions were a little bit more personally driven. My initial reaction was like, oh no, we can't talk about this from a personal standpoint. And I think that is part of the issue, is that sometimes we there's so much stigma in terms of discussing the reality of burnout and other mental health concerns, that there's almost this idea of there's going to be judgment. And if I share that I've been burnt out before in ministry, that people are going to think that I am somehow less spiritual or less than, or there's some kind of glaring sin issue that has caused that, and that I need to be protective of that for myself, for my husband, or something like that. And so to be honest, I really, even knowing that, I still had to get on board with like, no, this is what we're going to talk about. And we're going to kind of move forward from there.
Well, thanks for saying that, because I think you're right. We do feel, I have experienced burnout in ministry, and it's something that's hard to acknowledge, not only to other people, but to myself sometimes, that I'm actually in that place. And so I'd love for you to tell us, how did you know that you were in that place?
Yeah, I think unfortunately a lot of times with burnout or other mental health concerns is that you start seeing the symptoms before you realize the cause. And so for me, I think that I was noticing, especially because I've worked in very emotionally taxing situations before, particularly with clients with really high suicide rates. There's this emotional numbing and kind of this desire to kind of protect yourself a little bit. So feeling really physically and emotionally just drained, worn out, easily overwhelmed, sometimes easily frustrated. And so kind of noticing those retrospectively after the fact. And then also having my husband, thankfully, who is able to point those things out to me, of course, in the most loving and kind manner possible, but really being able to be a partner and to help me to see that might be going on.
You mentioned the word numb, and I think that's a very common experience for pastors and pastors' wives, because we so often are caring for other people, and you were doing that in your job too. So that's a double whammy. But we're caring for other people. And so sometimes you might even know, hey, I'm not doing the greatest, but you don't even know what to do with that. You don't have, who do you take that to? When do you have time to even explore that? What do you do with that? And so we kind of keep going. And I think that's when I have become numb, is when I just try to push through. Would you say that's what you mean by that word, numb?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is this sense that there's no end in sight sometimes. And sometimes even when there is an end in sight to a particular task or to season, it still feels really overwhelming to even get there. And so you kind of have to have a little bit of, I don't want to say self-preservation, if that makes sense, but trying to not experience things so as intensely. And so, there is a little bit of that numbing process.
So was there a point where you acknowledged to yourself that maybe that word burnout applied to you? Did God did he do something in you that woke you up to that? What happened?
Yeah, I think in this particular instance that I'm thinking of, because I can think of really two seasons. So one of them certainly was in my professional life. And so again, as I was saying, was dealing with really intense emotional situations, other crisis type situations where I think that there was a lot of overwhelming stress, and part of that stress coming from really feeling this obligation that it was my job to fix it. And I certainly had to learn in that moment was that I'm not responsible for this change. And I have the greatest tool available to me, which is to pray on the behalf of those people that I was working with, specifically for God to intervene and to act in their lives. And so, of course, when you take that second and take a breath and remember that you're not the person responsible, that is a huge weight off your shoulders and a big relief. And then the other situation I think is probably a little more common, although certainly all of our pastors and ministry families experience different types of hurt and traumatic situations. But I started serving in our it's a private Christian school that our kids started attending during COVID. And ironically, even though it is a Christian school, it is made up of a lot of unchurched and unchristian families who had really switched during the pandemic because it gave them more freedom to attend class in person and to have some more control over their kids' educations. And so I think that as part of serving in ministry, a lot of times we get called to serve in the community in a way to attempt to engage our community and in particular non-believers or unchurched people in different aspects of ministry to have more exposure with Christians. And so I had been approached to do that and said yes, and it ended up being a task that was in the process of transition, and it required a lot more time than I was ready to give at that point. And unfortunately, just because of the state of things that were going on, there wasn't a quick exit plan. And so it was definitely causing some tension in our house that a lot of my free time and energy was having to kind of go to that. And then also in terms of distractions, I think, from our ministry and our church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that you're describing, we all feel to some level, it may not be to the burnout level, but we feel as pastors' wives, especially in church planting, we feel the weight of ministry alongside our husband. But we can tell ourselves, I'm not God. I can trust God with these things. But in the end, we also feel the responsibility and the weight of things. And so it's this kind of weird thing to hold where we're trusting God with it, but we still have responsibility. And so I'm wondering what you would say to us as pastors' wives of how we can be emotionally healthy and spiritually healthy in this life we're living.
Yeah, I think that obviously the best plan is to try to prevent burnout or to try to prevent some other type of mental health concern. And that's not always possible. But when you're able to, and I think as much as you can, especially if you're starting church planting, to from the beginning, as best you can, to have good work-life balances and rhythms of rest and continuing to have hobbies and interests outside of the church, and really kind of protecting what home looks like in that process of, okay, we're going to have really clear boundaries about how often we're going to talk about church or other things at home so that we can still have home be a place that is respite for us is definitely really important. I'm really grateful for, I work with Send Network, or work for Send Network, and getting to have this new value that Vance Pittman and the leadership team have instilled about sticking together, that we are certainly in a very unique role. And I'm so grateful for podcasts like this one and also, the other resources that you've made available and other resources that are out there for our ladies to interact with and ministry wives to interact with, because this is something that is really challenging. And I think that sometimes we feel this responsibility of protecting not only our own emotions, but even our spouses. And that almost sometimes is the harder challenge, is when it feels like it's your spouse's struggle in that moment that you have to protect that even more. And so having some kind of outlet is so necessary. And whether that be someone outside of your church, because it's going to need to be someone outside of your church, or another pastor's wife, and again, for women that don't have that, I'm grateful, because I think, like, for at least our spouse development team here at Send, is that I know that all of us would be happy to chat with someone and help get them connected to some kind of resource that could really benefit them. And then also that there's great free pastoral care phone numbers and different lines that people can call and to utilize, and just to have someone to piggyback with. And I see a lot of anonymous posts, to be honest with you, on these spouse pages that I'm a member of, because people just feel like they need to talk to someone, but they just can't be vulnerable sometimes, which is really challenging.
Yes, it is. I love how you described the sometimes I think the greater weight is carrying my husband's emotional health and feeling so responsible for him, for my kids, for the church. And there have been times where I think I've taken that on in a very unhealthy way, to where I diminish myself, and not in a self-denial way, but just in a very unhealthy way. And so I do think the things you've described are so important, that we have people outside of our church that we can talk to and just say, hey, is this normal? But also, what do I do here? And like, speak some truth to me, help me to see perspective on this. And so we want to link to that in the show notes, some of the things that you mentioned, because I think that's such a vital thing to have, where we can go outside of our church and outside of our own brain and talk to somebody else about what we're experiencing, because it is a lot. It's a lot. And you mentioned these things. I'm wondering if that's what helped you to get healthy, the things you mentioned, or are there other things that you did, or how God met you in that season of burnout? I'm thinking of the one specifically with your, when you were serving at the school and the church.
Yeah.
How did God meet you?
I think one of the good things about the serving at the school was helping me to recognize that I think one of the causes of burnout is that when we serve outside of our gifting and our passion, and a lot of times when we are serving in a way that feels like an obligation, and sometimes especially when you are doing church planting, there has to be the obligation because there's not always staff members to fill that role. And there is some tension there. But in terms of passion, there certainly were different ways that I could have served the school, but I felt a little bit of this obligation that I had placed on myself to serve in this way, because it would give potential voice and opportunities for us to engage with these different families, and an invitation into church in general, not just specifically our church, but into church in general. And so when there was a lot more work required, a lot of time and energy, just realizing that if this wasn't something I'm passionate about, then it's taking up all my time, and I need to find a different avenue and a different way to serve, because it is burning me out, because it's not my passion.
Mm-hmm. That's so good. So last question, Andrea, I'm just thinking about women out there who are like, that's me. Everything she's saying, I'm burnt out. I'm serving in areas I'm not passionate about. I'm carrying the weight of everyone's emotional health, including my own, my husband's. What are some things that you would say to women who are listening who may be experiencing burnout?
Yeah, I certainly would say that you're not alone. And, the statistics are at least half of people serving in ministry or other helping professionals are experiencing burnout or have experienced burnout. And so that, unfortunately, it's not a unique thing to you. And so I think that normalizing the fact that it is happening is really important for people to realize that, again, it's not just you. You're not the only person. This isn't a deficit about you necessarily, that this is about this possibly this season and just maybe a mismatch of priorities and ways that you're serving. Certainly you want to include your spouse in that conversation, right? That's the most important relationship outside of our relationship with Christ, is there with your helpmate. And so being able to have sometimes really challenging conversations, because sometimes your spouse really does need you to still serve in a certain way. And how can you change that or set some more boundaries? And that may require you talking to someone else first to be able to navigate that conversation, again, with another trusted pastor's wife or with a coach or someone else to have those conversations. And then I think depending on what is the source of burnout, to seek scripture that really speaks to you in that season. So again, I personally was describing feeling numb. And so scripture about creating in me a new heart and being able to think about God revitalizing my heart or my stiff-neckedness, as well as also to just remember how big God is. And so, these passages, for example, like in Job, not necessarily about Job's suffering, but about how God shows up and reminds Job of who he is and his authority in the created order, right? And that he is in charge of everything.
Yes.
And to be able to rest in him.
That's so good. What comes to mind for me, I would say there have been times where there have been years where I'm like, Lord, I don't think my joy is ever going to come back. Like my cynicism, my bitterness, it's far outweighing any sort of joy that I have in serving you and being with you. And I would say to anybody listening who's like, that's me, that there is hope that your joy will return. And, I think of that verse, restore to me the joy of your salvation. God will answer that prayer. That is a prayer he will answer. And he's done that for me. And I think some of it has come through kind of reaching those places of burnout and just saying, you know what, this isn't working for me anymore. This isn't working for us as a couple. This isn't working for us as a family. We've got to think of a new way of doing this that works for us, where we can have some refreshment and then Lord brings joy in that. So for anyone listening who's like, I just don't think I'll ever have joy again, the Lord he will restore your joy. And I love what Andrea has given for us to think about today. So thank you, Andrea, for joining me.
Thank you, Christine, for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to the Ministry Wives podcast, a production of the North American Mission Board. If you found this content helpful, please subscribe, rate, and review us on your podcast platform or share it with a friend. You can find this podcast and other helpful resources at ministrywivespodcast.com.